Good afternoon. My name is Bruce Poinsette. Today I'm here with Mitchell S. Jackson, acclaimed author, professor, filmmaker, criminal justice advocate, and thank you for being with me.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, man.
And today we're talking about the history of Alberta,
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in the neighborhood. And earlier you were talking with some kids here at King School about being with the King Tumblers back in the day.
Yes.
And, your neighbor Charles Kane specifically.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I think when I was young, I was trying to find an identity, like all young kids, and most of us found it through sports in some way, and even before sports, because that was actually before I was like in any organized sport. Like, I was trying to figure out what was going to like both set me apart from the other kids, but also like make me a member of the group. And then the tumbling team was one of those things that was like a point of pride for the school. So it just became a goal of mine. And I was never at anything that I did the best. So my neighbor Charles Kane was like the best tumbler. So, and I recognized that, but like I just wanted to be a part of something that meant something to some people.
And what do the King School Tumblers just mean as far as like to the neighborhood and to the area?
Oh, well, I mean, it just seemed like everyone was excited because we used to go tour to other schools, and I guess maybe for their like pep rally assemblies or something. It was like a special thing to be on the tumbling team. And I imagine you had to have like good grades and no like, behavioral problems to be on the team. And then it was school wide. So it was everyone from like kindergartners up to fifth graders were on the team. So it was also like a community. Some of those guys that were on the tumbling team with me years and years and years ago, like they ended up going to middle school with me. They were high school teammates. So it established lifelong relationships.
And you said Charles Kane specifically was
the
greatest gymnast
the
you've
GOAT.
ever seen in person.
Should have went to the Olympics.
And you just talk about like when you say he's the greatest, like
Yeah.
just talk about his feats a little bit more.
Okay, so I don't know if it's out there now because I haven't been on the playground, but it used to be like a tire swing, and the tire swing is probably something. Whatever was holding it was like this I don't know, these logs that had been put together, and they were probably like 8 feet high. I mean, they might have been lower, but at that age, they looked, 8-10 feet high. And Charles would go up there and like flip off of them. So it was like feats of like daredevil nature. He would do that, or we had a springboard. So it was like he would do, like most people would do a backflip and it would be one, right? Like he would do a double backflip off the springboard. Or if you challenge him, he would just like do backflips down the whole the concrete out there where the basketball courts are, just the whole way. And to me, that was like that. To me now, seeing all I've seen, that is superhuman for a person to be. And we weren't trained gymnasts, right? Like, I mean, there was a little bit of schooling, but like we weren't getting professional tutelage on how to do this. This was like God-given ability, and then also what I always admired was the audacity to even try that. Right? It took me a long time to build up the courage to try to do a backflip off of the springboard. I was not about to climb up 8 feet and do a backflip, but he would do that like walking. So I think what I've always admired is a person who's audacious, who's like willing to do what the other person is like fearful of doing.
And was Charles able to go on to like greater gymnastic success?
Well, that's the thing about being in Northeast, like your talents kind of just fall by the wayside. I mean, I feel like he graduated from Grant. I hope he graduated. Or he went to Grant. I hope he graduated. I'm pretty sure he did. And, I think he just, started working, had a few kids. I mean, he was gangbanging for a little while at some point. Just got caught up in the same stuff we all got caught up in. And there were so few of us who had not only the talent, but the perseverance, the talent, and the focus, and then had like the mentorship to make it out. And because we were all out there living without a map, right? So Charles didn't know how to become an Olympic gymnast. None of us did. So he made the best of a circumstance.
That's a theme you kind of explore a lot in your writing, as far as specifically with like sports and like black male identity.
Yeah.
In terms of, like, can you just talk a little bit about, I guess, well, one, you played basketball, Jeff.
Yeah.
Like, you just talk about, one, how much basketball specifically meant to like you and kids in your neighborhood.
Yeah. Well, they have the thing now, they say, ball is life, right? And it sounds cool, but ball was really life for us. I mean, there was probably an era of my life between me being, I'd say 14 until I was probably 20, when like my identity was built on being a good basketball player. And again, I was never the best. So that's like a precarious position to be in, to build your identity on something where you will never be the one. But I played it all the time. I went everywhere. Like, we would go to Clark College, or we would go to Tualatin, or we would go to all the parks. We go to Alberta Park, Irving Park, Laurelhurst Park, Fern Hill Park. Like, and these are like, at the time, it was also like a fraternity, because the good basketball players would wake up on a good day and everyone would send around a call, or maybe we were texting at that time, but like, you know, it'd be like 9 a.m. on a Saturday, and they're like, okay, we running here, be there. And it was 15, 20 dudes on the tech, and if you weren't one of those dudes, that means you also weren't no real baller, right? And so we'll all show up to the park and start choosing up teams and play and really battle, and like talk crazy to each other. And but it was community, it was competition, it was a source of our identity. And then that night we would all go home and get cleaned up, and you know, take showers and say, okay, we're gonna meet here, and we'll go meet, and then we'll go kick it that night. And that was what we did, like, for years and years and years and years. And some of those guys were great at what they did, right? Some of them did go pro, and a lot of them went on to coach. And you know, there's Pat now who's coaching Jeff, and he was definitely one of the ones. But it was a culture for us, and it really was the thing. For me, it was the thing that like kept me going at a time when I didn't have another identity, where I didn't have a focus. And because I was also selling drugs, if I didn't have that grounding, like, I really would have went left. Like, I was already going left. Like, I would have went all the way off the edge left.
And yeah, talking about sort of that intersection between basketball culture and the drug game and mass incarceration.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about, I guess, like, or do you believe there's an effect, like, if you, because I feel like so many, especially for black males in Oregon, where identity is tied to sports.
Yeah.
Like, not just internally, but externally.
Yeah.
Like, I think of just a quick example from like my days. I remember we had I play with guys in the NBA now, but like our junior year, we brought in transfers, including a kid from Northeast. And, you know, I remember, because I had a class with him, and he would, you know, he'd show up whenever in the class, like halfway through, sometimes not at all.
Yeah.
But, you know, they loved him. They loved him until, you know,
until his grades wasn't cool.
Well, not even until the grades were fine, but until the season was over, championship was won, that was secure. And then next time, I remember seeing him when I went to college, because you know, he was like D2, maybe low D1 prospect before he transferred. I remember seeing him. He was at, you know, just at a run at college, and he was maybe at the, you know, Lane or something, Lane Community College, and it's just like they just threw him by the wayside. And I just, you know, I see so many parallels between, like I said, that's out in the suburbs. But, yeah, can you just talk about sort of like the effect, I guess, that kind of has?
Well, I think we suffer from a dearth of other examples of success. And, you know, there was like Paul Knowles and Geneva and Tony Hobson. But even Tony Hobson, I would argue that Tony's legacy, a part of Tony's legacy, when like people first think of Tony Hobson, which is really saying SEI, then what they first remember is that he won a championship for Jeff in 1972. Now, don't ask me why I know that year, but I know that year. It's 1972. Tony Hobson and Ray Leary and Charles Channel and Carl Bird and Roddy Cole why do I know those guys' names? They won a championship. That's legend, right? So, and then he went on to become a community activist and set up a program that has probably saved thousands of kids' lives here. But at the heart of that was basketball, right? Mm-hmm. So when we hear stories, hero stories, we hear Mel Renfro, we hear Gary Ladd, we hear Woodrow Green, we hear Tony Hobson, and there was no literary stars for me to look up to. Not that I would have done it anyway. Like, I really wasn't even a part of literature, but like, it is what we know, I guess, because it's like one of the little girls downstairs said, race defines you. And I said, well, if you say it defines you, then you're also saying that it is presenting borders of what you can be. And I think that because basketball defined us, it also drew borders around us and said, this is the life that you can live. Here are your possibilities. And for some of us, that was fine because we had enough to keep going with it. And then for some of us, it was very detrimental because we weren't going to make it, but we were still in that box and we couldn't see out of it. And so luckily, I kept going and I had enough, I don't know, presence of options to like get to see it outside of the box a little bit, but it ruined people. And I guess we could say the same thing for like dealing drugs, right? Like at a certain point, you become a drug dealer. And that was one thing I never did. Like I never became a drug. I sold drugs, but like when you become a drug dealer, then you do everything that is necessary to be a drug dealer, which also means at some point you're going to have to harm someone. Seriously, physically harm someone. And I could never bring myself to that place. So I somehow got outside of that little box, but I know plenty of dudes who was like all the way about it, right? And if you all the way about it and you a dope dealer, at some point somebody gonna take something from you or try to, and then there's consequences for that. And I didn't want to take it there. And, you know, a lot of guys did, which again, if we say, connects us back to mass incarceration, but it's really that, it's that box. You know, what's the definition?
Is there any kind of like, I guess, sort of the feeling of like, I guess, searching for, I don't want to say past glory, but, you know, like with basketball, because, you know, your success is so much tied to that, like when that's over, it's like looking for it, whether it's in the drug game or whatever. Absolutely.
I don't want to mention any names, but I've seen dozens of dudes who were high school stars who, you know, after, because if you're a high school star, there's a really good chance you're going to go to play college ball. At least maybe it's a community college, but you're going to get a chance to keep playing. But if you finish junior college or you finish either your 3 or 4 years at a university, at some point you're going to be back here, right? And then the thing is, because even the community has a limited perspective on the possibilities for us, they are still going to define you by who you were. So even if you are like, nah, I'm the UPS guy now, they're like, oh, there's such and such that used to play for such and such. Man, you was cold, right? So like, you can't really go anywhere if you were a star, especially where people aren't going to define you by who you were. And I would imagine that's going to grate on you because you're not that person. There is 700 people are not coming to the Child Center or to Jefferson High School to watch you play on a Friday. Like, you might get 30 people in there on a Saturday morning to watch you kill somebody in open gym, but like, you've lost that, and people are still defining you by that. So it's like, how are you going to reclaim some of that? In some ways, you know, drugs looks like an opportunity. A lot of guys go into coaching, right, just to stay close to it. But you got to figure out how to keep the cheers going.
And as far as just kind of going back to, you know, the earlier school days, and with you and, you know, getting into writing, because I remember, you know, we talked for an interview back at my old job, and one of the things you said as far as like your first real entry points into writing was like doing love letters here at King School.
Here, that's right.
And like, do you think, like, I guess, you know, having something where you had like, you got a little bit of feedback, you got some validation, that kind of planted the seeds for
you know, I would say that writing good love letters is essaying, right? So the essay, if we go back to the history of the essay, Montaigne, the French writer who created the essay means to try or to attempt, right? And so to try or to attempt to persuade someone of something. And because you have an essay, just like it is in filmmaking, you have to be aware of who the audience is for whatever you're writing. And so I think why I was a good love note maker is because I understood that the audience was going to be different depending on, the girl made a different audience. And so I was essaying, but I was like framing my love letters / essays for an audience. And maybe that's something that the other guys can do. They got stock game, right? They just gonna say the same thing to everyone. It ain't gonna work out because they're different people. And so if you take that years later, like now I teach the essay and I talk to my students about, well, who are we writing for? And like, well, what is your ethos? That's another thing I'm really big on. Is like, what is your authority on the page? And if we, fast forward, like sometimes your authority in grade school is like, you're the best tumbler, or like you the one that everybody picks on the team at lunchtime to play ball. So the authority changes, but it's still recognizing what is your authority, who is the audience, and then how can you communicate, how can you speak to that, how can you recognize your authority and then speak to that audience. So I do think that I didn't recognize it then, but yeah, I can see that playing all the way through now to even beyond my writing, to what I tell my students about writing.
And on a similar vein, you also, you were telling the kids earlier about, getting your friends to play school.
Yeah.
Back in the day with the encyclopedias. Can you, tell us a little bit more about that?
So, that's really the story that I told. I think I would have to fast forward and say this was like an era in the neighborhood where it was like right on the cusp of being gentrified, right? So like,
what years were these?
This had to be early to mid 80s, right? So first there was like a white dude that would like go house to house and say like, do you want siding on your house, right? Like we put I think the siding is still up on the house that we got. So my grandmother, maybe they loved, what it was? I didn't even think about this. My great-grandfather used to be a door-to-door salesman in Alabama. And when he first moved here, he used to sell Watkins products. And when he came here, he was also a Watkins product salesman. So it makes sense now that they had a soft spot for people going door to door selling products, because once they had people that came by and they sold the water purifiers. You put them on your sink and you get pure water. This is when people wasn't on the pure water stuff. And they bought that. Then the guy came and they were like, we're selling vinyl siding for your house. You never have to paint your house again. You put the vinyl siding up, cool. And they bought that. And then one summer, guy came around, he was selling encyclopedias. And my grandmother was an old school teacher, used to teach at Vernon, and I can't remember where else. My great grandmother. And they bought encyclopedias for me. I remember they were brown. It felt like they were leather, but I know they weren't leather. They had the gold foil writing on them. And somehow that summer, I had got a new desk. It was a roll top desk. So I had my 2 encyclopedias and my roll top desk. And we played all through the summer, tag, basketball, go-kart, flipping up here at King, all that stuff. But then summer was nearing an end. And I said, man, I gotta get back ready for school. But I know it's gonna be harder for me to do it if everybody outside playing. So I'm like, okay, I got it. Let me convince them that the playing should actually be prepping for school. So I go outside, I'm like, man, I got these new encyclopedias, and y'all should just come on in here, man. We can get ready for 4th grade. They're like, what? Like, yeah, man, we can get ready for 4th grade. But people always like understood that I was serious about school. So I think Charles came, my homeboy used to live across the street, Tyrell came, maybe like 1 or 2 other dudes, but I would get him in there some days and we would just be reading and writing. And that said a couple things to me. One, I was a leader. I could go my own way, right? It also instilled in me the value of being prepared for school and treating school like school to me was never just what you did in those 9 months. It was like, no, I'm a lifelong learner. And also because I was a leader, that I can influence other people who wouldn't otherwise want to do that. And those were really, those are assets that have been very fruitful for all of my life.
And you said this is around the cusp of when it started, gentrifying.
Yeah.
Can you just talk about what the neighborhood looked like back then?
Well, there was always a rundown house or two on your block, right? It was just.
And where was this?
This is, well, at this time, I mean, I grew up all around Northeast, but I spent the most time in the place that I call home is on the corner of 6th and Mason. So, I don't know, 6 blocks away from where we are now at King. So there was always like, there was a lady who like never opened her blinds, right? So there was that house, and then there was like the real rundown house next to us, and then there at the end of the block there was like a duplex where they had these Native Americans there who like always had a car in their yard, like a car, dismantled car, be a tire here and some part of an engine over here, and there was that, and then across the street was my brother's mother's house. So it was like a kind of rundown, smallish. It wasn't rundown, but it was never like painted new. It was a pink house on the end of the block. So it was like varying states of disrepair on the block. And the reason I say it was on the cusp is because I think that those white people were like prospecting this neighborhood, right? They were like, well, if we can convince them to put some siding on it, like a couple years later, that house is going to be worth more money. Because right after that, that's when people also started coming by saying, we'll buy your house, right? Like, we'll give you $30,000 cash for this house. And some people did sell their house and moved out of the neighborhood. So it seemed like nothing gets gentrified overnight. And I would argue that the process of that is connected to some kind of city planning or something that is outside the neighbor's vision, the neighborhood's vision of itself, and that those people, I'm not saying all of them, but someone had to know that these were the steps to make this happen, because by mid 90s it was in full thrust.
Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of that change over time, like, and also like originally like back in the 80s when you were growing up, like I guess like what kind of closeness there was and like how that has also kind of changed.
Yeah, well, I feel like it was close because, most people after the flood, Vanport flood, moved to Northeast, right? So like it ain't that big. So if you were going somewhere on an outing, if you were going to the park, like there was only a few places to go, and also we were all being schooled in the same schools, right? So our parents grew up with each other. It's so many times I would be somewhere and an adult would say like, I know your daddy, or I know your uncle, or it's crazy because like an old head might know your daddy and you don't. Right? And be like, oh, that's such and such son. You look just like a daddy. Your daddy ain't even claiming him. But that was the community, right? Like Northeast was small, and we all went to the same schools, shopped at the same grocery store. Like we all shopped at Fred Meyer's or Safeway. Like that was it, right? Or you went over to, I forgot the place that used to be over there on Killingsworth. They used to sell dented canned goods. Man, I can't remember the name of that store, but my uncle used to work at St. Vincent de Paul, which was on the corner of Vancouver and Killingsworth, and there was a store right across the street, B Company, I think it was called. Used to sell like, perishables that were beyond their date and canned goods that were dented. So, we would see each other, and then it was a different era because we didn't have, this is like pre-video gaming, so kids were not in the house, like talking to people that were on the other side of the earth. Like we were actually outside making stuff and playing tag. And I used to get coffee cans and bang on them like they were drums, and or go over somebody's house and be in the basement tearing up stuff, and we know we ain't got no business doing it. So like there were all these moments for us to be a community, which made it also that much more troubling when the gangs came, because we weren't all, I mean, it was like we were cousins. Like, it was like everybody, at least your second cousin or third cousin, right? Like, you know this dude, and you funking with him. But yeah, so it felt like very much like a community. I could, like, when I drive around here now, I go, oh, that's where homeboy used to live, or that's where my partner used to live, or right here I did this, or I go, oh, I used to go to Jack's and get the chicken wings, which I think Jack's still making them chicken wings right behind us, right on 9th. So just like everything to me is a monument of my old life. And when I say monument, it's like, it's important, right? It's somebody else is just like, oh, that's where the convenience store is. No, to me, 9th is a monument, right? If we were to go 2 blocks over here, like I went to St. Andrew's Church. I might have been baptized there, I'm not sure. But like, if I go past that parking lot, I can remember walking out of the ramp, or walking out of the church and walking down the ramp and getting in my grandfather's station wagon after church, right? Like, or walking out the front and asking them for money to go to 9th Street and get some food. I mean, like everything is, oh, that happened there. And it's not just like a passing, fleeting, like inconsequential thing. It's like an important moment of my evolution. Every time I get to do something that I think is special, I ask myself, how the hell did I get here? March? 2 months ago, I was at Cornell University, and they asked me to come talk, and they were like, what you gonna talk about? And I didn't really know, so I was at the time I was reading something for an essay that I was working on. It was Martin Luther King's The Other American speech. So I said, all right, I'm gonna do The Other American, just like offhanded, right? So then once I said it though, then I actually had to come up with the speech. So I work, and I come up with a speech. So then I go and I give the speech. And then when I finished the speech, first of all, they put me in a place called Sage Hall, which is it's a cathedral. And when I walked in, I'm like, why they got me in a church? But I don't want to say nothing. It's Cornell. I'm like, y'all could put me, we're really where y'all want to put me. I'm thankful to be here. So I do my speech, I finish my speech, and then afterwards, the dean comes over to me and he says, do you see that plaque over there? And I said, no, I hadn't been paying attention to the plaque. He said, you should go read it. And I go over there and read it, and it says Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. spoke right here in this lectern. And I was like, wow, they put me in the same place where Martin Luther King spoke to give the Other American speech, which is, it's not a reprisal of his speech, but it was definitely inspired, and took the title from his speech. And then I said to myself, when I finished, later that night, I was like, but I went to Martin Luther King Elementary School. And I was like, is that disconnected from me being able to give this speech at Cornell? I don't think so. So now when I walk up to MLK Junior School, I think now like, wow, look at that arc. Like, how did I get here? And I absolutely think that. Like, that's why all of this stuff is important to me. It might not be important to somebody else, but like Northeast is everything to me.
So it's got to be a kind of, because you live in NYC now.
Yes.
So it's got to be kind of jarring every time you come back in. Just.
Well, I guess, no, it's not jarring because I was coming back often enough to like see it in incremental stages. Mm-hmm. But still, when I drive down Vancouver or Williams, or I go over there by Fremont and I see all this construction and I see the new buildings, it is, obviously it doesn't look familiar, but I wouldn't call it jarring, but it's also like, it doesn't feel native to me. And you know, even before that, like when I come home, right, I'm always expecting to see a few people on the plane. I'm like, it can't be that many of us. So like, I should know somebody on a plane headed to Portland. And I get on these planes and I don't see nothing but white folks. Like, I'm like, damn, were we really that small a community that I never see any people of color on my way home? Never. And then yesterday I went to go see Black Panther. Well, first of all, I went to go see Black Panther. This is my third time, right? The first 2 times I went to the Magic Johnson Theater in Harlem. It does not get any more black than that, right? It was a party. I went the night before it opened, and then I went the Saturday after it opened, right? People in there in all their garb, and they outside, dancing, and they taking pic. I mean, it's like literally a party. And they got like film crews there shooting. That's how much of a party it is at Magic Johnson Theater, right? Well, I took my mama to see Black Panther yesterday in the theater. About midway through, I just looked over to the side, and it was nothing but white people. And when I say I did not see another person of color in the theater, and I said, God, dog, like, this is Portland. This is the Portland that I never saw, because back then we were all in this space, so it felt like a black community. But Portland it's what they say it is, right? Like, if you go look at the statistics, it's like it is white, but I just never saw that. And now I get the perspective of like seeing, no, this place is white. Like, if you thought it was something else, you were misled.
And yeah, kind of on that same note, like, you just talk about the importance, because the demographics of whether it's Portland or Oregon as a whole, like, the importance of preserving these stories, especially like Northeast Portland you grew up in.
Yeah, well, man, I have dedicated my literary life to that. My first book is like it's a ledger of what happened in the 90s to the 2000s, or maybe the 80s to the 2000s. And the book that I'm working on now is called Survival Math, and it is a ledger of what happened in this place since before it was even a place. Since Marcus Lopez came here in, 1775. I look around, and I know when I was coming up, I didn't have anyone that I could point to that was saying they were taking a note of what was happening and leaving a written record of this. Now, there were journalists, right? Like, we had the Scanner, and thank God for, Bernie and Bonnie, right? Bernie and Bonnie. Who owned the Scanner? Bernie and Bonnie, yeah. And, the Washingtons and the Portland Observer, so I don't want to knock their part in like preserving our history, but there's something to be said for like what literature does, and also for the amount of respect that literature commands to the wider world. And so I recognize that now. Like, maybe I didn't recognize it as much when I first wrote Residue, but like, I've seen a lot of things since Residue has come out. I've been in some rooms that I definitely didn't think I was going to be in. I've had conversations with people that I didn't think that I was going to have. And I know that it all has come out of me essentially trying to preserve my personal history. That's what I did in Residue. And now my job is not just to preserve my personal history here, but to preserve the history of my people in this place, which is a much bigger task. Because in that, I can't lose either my personal history or my family's history, but I think it's absolutely important that someone doesn't. As far as I can see, I don't know anyone else that's done it. Like, I know that there's Renee Watson, and she's doing her thing. She's also in New York, and there's a few other writers. But when I think about like who is the writer from Northeast Portland that like lived this shit for a couple of generations, I don't know who that is. And so, why not me?
It's interesting you talk about, being able to be in these different rooms, these different spaces, and just, I guess, because we talk about, preserving this history and, we can talk about the specific, these art markers and these historical markers, but just in terms of like, I guess the legitimacy you get from, you know, the rest of the world taking you seriously, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Versus Portland.
Well, I don't think it's not lost on me that the national recognition that I received has given me a different voice in Portland, right? Like if I didn't receive any kind of national accolades, I don't think people would receive me in the same way. So that's necessary, but I just actually had this conversation with another writer, but like it doesn't define me. And before anyone said anything about me, like in a review or a story or an interview or something, like I had worked a very long time at my craft to be in a position where I felt confident about what I can do. And that and that's one of the things I really want to emphasize is like, I started to do this in 1998, right? The book didn't come out until 2012. From 1999 until 2012, I was just a student of the craft. I mean, I wasn't just a student, like I was doing other things too, but like I knew that it was necessary for me to go all that time working. And someone else would have said, well, I have a story that I know people are interested in, like why not just put out a book? Just any book will do it. And I never wanted to do that. And I think, you know, one of the things that I hope people recognize about what I do is that there is a level of artistic integrity that I'm not willing to compromise. And that, to me, it's not just about the story, it's about making the story into art. And that's, when I say that's the goal, like that's the goal, right? It's like, I turned this, really a lot, I mean, it's not all misery, but it's like, it's some misery, it's some happiness, but it's really, I turned this experience into something that is valuable. And also, if we're calling it literature, it also means that it's everlasting, right? That like 20, 30 years, someone can pick up this book and say, here is an account of how these people lived. And also that in some way is beautiful, right? Like it's beautiful to read, even if what you're reading about is trauma.
It's kind of like, you know, primary source material. Almost.
Yeah, it is. A novel is primary source, yeah, definitely.
And yeah, when you're talking about, because that reminds me of a quote, you know, you actually gave me, like I said a few years ago about, I guess, not telling hackneyed stories or like the hackneyed quote unquote urban story.
Yeah.
And I always feel like with writing, it's just as much sort of about your eye and your unique perspective as it is like your craft with your skills,
yeah,
whether it's the words or grammar.
Yeah.
Like, can you just talk about like how, you know, just your specific like observations and just, you know, those experiences have, you know, informed your writing and allowed you to have, I guess, the depth to, you know, connect with these, you know, outside audiences that might otherwise, I guess, just dismiss it as, you know, another urban story?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one of the things that I try to do is be the most of myself in any space that I'm in. And in some cases that hurts me, right? So for years it hurt me in academia because I was like unwilling to wear my Dockers and my button-up shirt and my tie or my sport coat, and I would come to the meetings sometimes. I don't always go to the meetings. I would come to the meetings and I could see the way that my colleagues looked at me, right? And I know that they don't, or they didn't at least, respect what I could do, because we would sometimes do like exercises or something. This is just all colleagues. And I would say something in our, you know, exercise, and they were like, oh, wow, Mitch, like that was really intelligent, or like you're so well spoken. I'd be like, but I'm an English professor, right? Like, well, what were you expecting? But again, being myself, I think ultimately paid off. Like when I was a part-time professor, right, I achieved a certain measure of success, and I went into the dean's office and I was like, hey, here's my resume. This is what I've been doing, and you know, I think we should have a conversation. And that went from like, oh, well, why don't we make you full time? I was like, okay. Then it was like us negotiating on the contract. But that's not generally how academia works. Like, you can't just walk into your dean's office like, here my resume, give me a new job. But I also recognize that that was a part, like I never compromised that part of myself to get there quicker. So I took the long road, but I took the road that let me be most of me. And I do that in every single room I'm in, even when I'm like the least cool dude in the room, right? Like I might be around a bunch of like street dudes, and I'm not going to play up my streetness because now I'm in a room with some dudes that are killers. Like I'm not going to be tough because now the room is full of gangsters now. So I think that even if you don't like me, you have to respect that like I'm trying really hard to like be me. And that identity is always in flux, but I try really hard not to be someone else because that might make things easier for me in those circumstances. And I can live with that even if sometimes it's harmful to me.
And sort of staying on, I guess, just like perspectives, like I think one of the things like your work has been praised for is like the complexity and layers you give to a lot of characters. And yeah, can you just talk about, and it's like the importance, like, you know, we're talking earlier about the connection between, you know, basketball and sort of that, sort of, you know, after, you know, looking for glory afterwards.
Yeah.
Like, can you just talk about the importance of giving like those kind of layers and making those connections for, you know, a lot of people who, you know, just aren't going to see it otherwise?
Well, there's two things. One is like you have to be paying attention, right? Like you have to look at a person, be able to see a person, and then see what they aren't telling you, right? So to read the subtext. I think the other thing is you have to be compassionate and empathetic to everyone across the board. One of my writing mentors used to say, never put yourself above the other, right? Like if you can point out a fault in someone else, you also need to be able to point out a fault in yourself. If you can see someone else if you can be critical of someone else, you also need to be critical of yourself. And so I think when someone talks about like a complex character on the page, that is the product of like seeing someone with compassion and always asking, well, why? Well, why? I've had conversations with people that are like really quick to like condemn anything that is not aligned with their paradigms. Like, so whether it's political, whether we're talking about gender, like if it doesn't align with their paradigms, they're like, nah, that's wrong. And I'm always like, well, wait, what is this other side? Like, did you think about this? And sometimes people get mad at me like, well, why are you advocating for that? I'm like, no, I'm not advocating for it. I'm just saying that like, if we look at everyone in context, it changes things, right? And then you have to ask yourself, well, how far back do we need to go for context, right? Like, if he's a corrupt politician, like that's terrible. No one wants a corrupt politician, but like, how far back do we need to go to contextualize that? So I've been studying JFK, right? Like, it's like the worst philanderer in the White House, I imagine, right? Just like, you know, obviously he did some things that were heroic, but he was also like, I mean, he was tearing Jacqueline's heart out like so often, right? But then you're like, well, if you go back and look at him in context, well, his father was a notorious philanderer. His father was so cold, he used to like bring the mistress on vacation with him, right? And then there was this thing that like JFK had this like debilitating disease where he almost died like 3 or 4 times in his life. So he probably never thought he was far from death either, right? And then he had like this thing where his leg was longer than the other, one leg was longer than the other. Like he had these like physical ailments. So I'm like, well then, is it necessary to include that? Like his model, right? The patriarch of his house was like a serial philanderer, right? He was never far from dying. So do we need to view him in that light when we talk about what he was doing to Jackie? Now, I'm not trying to dismiss philandering or to say that he shouldn't have been penalized for what he did, but I won't just say like he's an evil person if I understand that everybody is in context.
just kind of piggybacking off of that,
Mm-hmm.
you also explore the topic of black masculinity. Can you just talk a little bit about how you explored in your work and how you personally sort of like how your worldview has evolved since, growing up on Sixth and Mason?
Yeah, black masculinity is like it's a cold box to be in, but it's both a box that like limits your options or make you feel like your options are limited, but also gives you tools for survival, right? So like, being tough or being cool is a tool of survival, and without it, I don't know how you survived the 1950s or 60s. I don't know how you survived the 1980s or 90s in Portland without being cool or tough, or you're gonna be somebody's mark. But then I also recognize like how damaging it is in interpersonal relationships with, or romantic relationships, or like how it can make you think that working a 9 to 5 rather than hustling is like a knock on your sense of manhood. So I see lots of ways in which it is helpful, in which it has helped me, and then other ways in which it's a limitation. But if I had to either like keep it or get rid of it, I would keep it because I wouldn't have made it.